FX Medicine is your gateway to news, resources and information on the safe, evidence-based approach to practicing complementary and integrative medicine. Visit fxmedicine.com.au to sign up for e-news and stay up to date with the latest research, podcasts and industry information. This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining me on the line today from Arizona in the USA is one of my most favourite people in the world, Dr. Lise Algela. Lise is a naturopathic doctor with board certification in naturopathic oncology and who's been practising since 1994. She maintains a naturopathic oncology practice out of naturopathic specialists in Scottsdale, Arizona. Lise works as an independent consultant in the area of practitioner and consumer health education. She's so famous that the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians recognised Lise in 2014 as Physician of the Year. Lise also received an honorary degree from the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine and the Joseph Pizzorno Founders Award from Bastyr University in the same year. She's currently the president of the Oncology Association of Naturopathic Physicians, that's OncAD. Learn more about this at www.drlise.net. She's the executive director of TAP Integrative, a non-profit educational resource for integrative practitioners. Lise is the co-author, along with Carolyn Gazella, of The Definitive Guide to Cancer and The Definitive Guide to Thriving After Cancer, texts which anyone who either wants to care for or just those who wish for the evidence regarding natural medicines need to read. Indeed, I would say that The Definitive Guide for Cancer is a seminal text that should be inclusive in all naturopathic courses. She co-created 5toThrivePlan.com, and Lise hosts a radio show, 5 to Thrive Live, on the Cancer Support Network about living more healthfully in the face of cancer. And I warmly welcome you back to FX Medicine. Lise, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Andrew. Delighted, as always, to be talking with you, my favourite Australian. How's that?
You only know one. No. Now I've got to say I've been baiting you over the last few months with beautiful pictures from the beach, the local beach where I live, on the Gold Coast. Yes, because we have hardly had a winter. It's been absolutely spectacular here. How's Arizona?
You know, it's we've had a hot summer in Arizona, but we've also had really lovely rains. Where I live, there is quite a good monsoon season, so we get some beautiful rains that come in, and so it's actually quite green, and our weather's just now turning to a nice, perfect temperature during the day. So I have to say, quite lovely over here.
Yeah. And you've recently come back from California, so you've been enjoying the California sunshine, I would imagine.
Yes, it was beautiful out there as well. You know, they're still in this prolonged drought, so they're pretty dry out there, but and it was hot, but yeah, beautiful area, beautiful part of the world for sure.
Now, it's a bit of a loose segue into what we're going to be talking about today, but I want to discuss telomeres. And I guess where I was going with the sort of variance in the climate is what happens with telomeres, because I feel like an absolute dunce with this. I think I've got it, and then something else comes out, and then that throws it out the window. So I think we have to first ask or answer for our listeners, what exactly are telomeres?
Well, I just have to say that when you asked if I would like to talk about telomeres, I jumped at the chance because I think these are some of the most fascinating parts of our, DNA structure. And we don't really know, we're learning still. They were just discovered in the 1930s, and then nobody really did anything about them because they were considered to be non-replicating parts of our DNA, so they weren't of interest. And it wasn't until the 1960s that we discovered that actually, because they didn't replicate, they must serve a function. And in fact, the opposite was happening. Every time the cell divides, these telomeres, which are, I think of them as protective caps that kind of squish on the end of each end of your chromosome so that they're protective caps. And each time your cell divides, a little bit of that telomere chunks off and they get shorter. And they get progressively shorter and shorter with each cell division. And it's thought there's about, average cells have about 50 cell divisions in our lifetime. And then the telomeres are so short that the chromosomes become very unstable. And with that instability, the cell initiates the process of apoptosis or programmed cell death, so that it's really the telomeres that control the lifespan of our cells. And therefore, when that happens, progressively as we go through this life, enough of our cells will no longer have telomeres left to support them that we start to lose, greater and greater quantities of cells, and eventually we will reach the end of our lifespan. So they really are at the very heart of our mortality, which is just so fascinating.
But when you say they're a cap, it's not just the end, it's sort of the end sequences, right? It's not just the very end, it's the sort of end region. Is that correct?
Yeah, the telomere itself is a double-looped structure, and it's made up of proteins and RNA, and they kind of loop around the end of the chromosome, literally stabilizing it. So they're not, they're not like a cap that fits over the chromosome, but they really do serve the function that you would think of if you thought of them as a cap, because that structure prevents it builds in a lot of structural stability into the chromosomes, literally enabling those chromosomes to withstand all of that tension that happens during cell division without becoming kind of destroyed in the process.
Right.
And, so then, as I said, as each cell division event happens, they get shorter and shorter, although that's not totally true. It's not exactly like that, because there's this enzyme that has been discovered even more recently. I think maybe you've known about telomerase for probably 40 years or 30 years. And telomerase is an enzyme whose job it is to build back length on the telomeres. And because of telomerase, the length of the telomeres over our lifespan is somewhat dynamic. And this is where it gets really interesting, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about this. But what we now know is that many of the behaviors of our lifestyle, going from sleep habits to exercise to certain nutrients, affect the activity of telomerase and therefore in turn affect the length of the telomeres, which means that we actually influence the stability of our chromosomes and therefore our lifespan through our lifestyle habits.
Now, this is where, as you said, I thought, shortening's bad and lengthening is good, but then there was some instances where in certain cancers there was a lengthening of the telomeres. Is that right? And there was this. Has it got to do with stability, or is it got to do with what happens during the lengthening, the shortening, the adjustment, if you like, of the cap? Dare I say the word?
Yeah, so I think the way to understand this is from a chronology standpoint. So we know a couple of things. We know that if telomeres are abnormally short, then your risk of cancer, of developing cancer, is significantly higher. There's about a threefold increase in the risk of cancer if you have short telomeres. So threefold, that's a 200% increased risk of cancer. And if you are diagnosed with cancer, among people diagnosed with cancer, those with the shortest telomeres have a twofold increased risk of dying from their cancer. So we know that abnormally short telomeres increase the risk of cancer, which makes sense because those shortened telomeres are a sign that chromosome, the chromosomes in that cell are unstable.
Right.
Which means that the DNA is more prone to mutation. There's more likely to be this process called aneuploidy, which is where the chromosomes get kind of stuck to each other during cell division and shear off in odd bits. And so all of that kind of makes sense. But to your point, there's this other phenomenon that happens further down the line. Once a tumor has begun, so that we've gone past the carcinoma in situ stage, we've gone past the, beginning to get invasive characteristics, and we really are truly into the tumorigenesis part of cancer. When we're at that point of cancer, there is a phenomenon that we see, which is one of the ways in which cancer gains its so-called immortality, is that it upregulates its telomerase enzyme. Right. So in these very mutated cells, they compensate, if you will, for the instability that is invariably present in malignant cells by upregulating telomerase, adding length back to those telomeres, and therefore gaining stability. So it is true that upregulated telomerase, longer telomeres are characteristic of cancer once it's set. But from a prevention standpoint, we really want long, healthy telomeres.
Right. So
this, if that makes any sense.
This is where I get confused in this chronology. People with short telomeres have not just an increased risk, but an increased risk of a worse prognosis of cancer, right? But once you have a tumour in situ, some cancers, as my understanding, will increase, will use that those telomeres to aid their immortality. So where is the chronology of the short telomere prognosis issue and the long telomere in the tumour?
Well, and I think another way to maybe clarify this is to think about it regionally too, because so short telomeres kind of across the board throughout the body.
Yep.
Shortened telomere, abnormally shortened telomeres. Means that cells throughout the body don't work well. So your lymphatic cells, your immune cells don't work very well. You don't have good cell repair throughout your body. Your epithelial basement membrane integrity to keep things where they're supposed to be, those cells don't work very well. So it's kind of a universal phenomenon. Now, this is where it gets interesting because in the case of malignancy, what we have happening is within the cancer cells themselves, there's a constitutive upregulated telomerase. So the tumor cells have figured out a way to turn on their telomerase and add length back to their telomeres to compensate for all the instability that is invariably present within malignant cells. That happens at the same time, or can happen at the same time as within the rest of the body, telomerase is not upregulated in healthy cells. In fact, it's kind of downregulated because perhaps of various lifestyle factors. And so telomeres are abnormally short everywhere else. So the worst sort of combination of events is abnormally short telomeres throughout the body and upregulated telomerase within tumors, making cancer cells telomeres abnormally long.
Gotcha. Now, here's another one that I've only just looking at the other day, and that was telomerase reverse transcriptase, or TERT, which is sort of, is it a subunit of telomerase or it's sort of part of the telomerase, and that's part of the sort of cancer role? Is that right?
Yeah, there's some really interesting research now going on into TERT, and I actually don't know very much about the role of TERT specifically, but I know that there is, from what I understand anyway, that there's different ways to both up and down regulate telomeres. So I think some of the interest now is there a way we could turn off telomerase in malignant cells? And, of course, everything within oncology is now getting focused on to very targeted drugs. So I think the idea ultimately behind that concept is, can we develop a drug that will turn off that telomerase, thereby kind of letting these cancer cells stay very unstable, making them highly susceptible to any other oxidative insult, likely chemotherapy or whatever the case might be.
But what I see an inherent danger there is that if you're trying to target turning off the telomerase in the tumour cell without affecting telomerase in the body, you're going to run into some crossover there. But what I think is interesting is, I just touched on this. Forgive me, I can't remember where I read it, but they were looking at things like vitamin A derivatives and things like catechin derivatives, like from green tea. So I think this is a very interesting area where natural medicine might play a part, at the very least, in supporting the medicine and potentially having a role on its own.
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting is that there are a lot of compounds and ways in which we can influence telomerase. And I think, it's actually, just to go back to this conversation for a second, I think it's really important to think about altering telomeres in a preventive context is somewhat different than altering telomeres in an active cancer.
Right.
Because, the role is very different, et cetera. So in a preventive context, there are actually a lot of factors that were very clear will up or down regulate telomerase. And in doing that, will clearly influence the length of telomeres. One of which, just to kind of start off the conversation, is just very basic lifestyle. Starting as basic as you can get with diet. Mm-hmm. It's very clear that a Mediterranean-style diet increases telomere length, and this has been shown in several prospective, big, large, clinical trials. There's one that came out of the Nurses' Health Study, which is a very large study of many thousand, over 100,000 nurses, and they took a subset of these women, over 30,000 of them, who they got blood samples from, were able to measure their telomeres, correlated their telomere length with their diet pattern, and they found that those women who ate as closely as possible to the Mediterranean diet, so high plant, whole food, unprocessed food type of diet, had the longest telomeres quite significantly, more than those women who were far away from the Mediterranean diet.
Right.
And that's just, that's super basic, but that's a good starting point for sure. It's just to think about the impact of days and decades of eating healthfully and what that's doing to our telomeres.
Hmm. But there were also some very good data with exercise, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exercise is another one. It's very clear that regular physical activity increases telomere length, and when you combine regular exercise, healthy diet, not smoking, maintaining, basically healthy body weight, you can increase telomere length by like 30% over controls or over any other combination. So it's kind of the synergy of all these things together is more impactful than any one thing alone.
Yeah.
But exercise for sure, diet for sure. Those would be, I would say, the sort of two kind of baselines, if you will. And then actually, interestingly, Dean Ornish has done some really interesting studies on telomerase upregulation through various lifestyle interventions, and has also made the case that stress is a really good way to shorten your telomeres prematurely, and
right.
that meditation and mindfulness and even just simple breathing exercises, social support, anything we can do to decrease stress has the opposite effect, increases the length of our telomeres.
Gotcha. So what's interesting to me is like there was the initial dietary or caloric restriction studies, and they worked really well in rhesus monkeys, didn't really translate to humans. And I wonder if stress was one of the factors there because it was a change. But what I don't know, I keep on pondering on this, and that is the Mediterranean diet. That is the true Mediterranean diet eaten by Mediterranean people, is a very social interaction. And I wonder if part of this caloric restriction is because a mealtime thing is a very social interaction where people are talking and discussing certain things. And when you're talking and discussing things, and I made the flippant remark in a podcast the other day that if you're talking with your hands, then you can't pick up the knife and fork to eat. And so part of it is sort of inadvertent caloric restriction. And so what that allows is the hunger hormones to take their place and to work on satiety. So therefore you've got this automatic caloric restriction. Where does that fit?
Yep.
Do you think that's part of the answer that Dean Ornish might be finding, or do you think it's a different issue that he's looking at?
No, I mean, I think you're onto something. I don't know that that's been studied per se, but it sure makes a lot of sense. There's been several studies that have definitely linked stress and in particular depression to shorter telomere length. So
right.
We know that mood and affect, and I would certainly, to your point, say that the manner and the mood with which we eat is going to have a pretty important role to play. And it even gets more interesting because actually the the mood state of your mother influences you as the child, your future mood, behavioral issues, in part by the way in which her mood, like particularly, let's say a mother is depressed and she's pregnant, her depression, her children are at increased risk for having short telomeres, and those children are also at an increased risk of having various behavioral disorders, and specifically something called oppositional defiant behavior disorder. That being neither here nor there. The point being that there's a bit of a generational or epigenetic effect that happens. So I think that's a whole other area, because if you think too about the Mediterranean diet, that's also a multi-generational pattern of eating, and not just the foods, but the way in which foods are eaten.
Just 2 words: do not. Sorry, doing that oppositional thing, I couldn't resist. So apart from the basics, and I got to say, I tend to, looking at the evidence now, I tend to sort of stratify. I know they're very closely linked, but I tend to stratify exercise above diet with regards to cancer support. And there was some recent things that I learnt about, indeed some exciting Australian research where they're looking at specific exercises for specific types of cancer. To alleviate risk factors of therapy, like, for instance, jumping with prostate cancer to alleviate the bone loss from the androgen blockers. It was better than just resistant exercise on its own. So I tend to sort of go, well, it's easier to try and get somebody to initiate an exercise regime than to change long ingrained dietary habits. Not saying they're not important, but I thought as a number one thing I'd go exercise and then diet. But you've got a lot more experience than I on helping people change. So how do you stratify exercise and diet and then other things?
Well, keeping this focus specifically on telomeres, if that's my goal, then I think that I would actually put something else above both exercise and diet, which I'll tell you in a moment.
Yeah.
I'll be in suspense for just a sec. But, with regards to cancer, I 100% agree. I often will say if I was put on a desert island and I could only take one cancer prevention tool with me, I would take exercise, because it is by far the most impactful way to reduce risk. And now we know that it's never too late to start. People who are diagnosed with cancer who exercise will reduce their risk of dying from their cancer, will improve their health and vitality throughout the treatment for cancer. And it's just so impactful at every step.
Yeah.
And we also know it doesn't mean you have to go to a gym, any kind of exercise, any kind of movement throughout the day counts. So it's just a really doable strategy to your point.
And also it doesn't have to be a task. I saw, and forgive me, this was a TV program, so it was one of those N=1 type things. But one of the best improvements that they found was dancing. So I think this is the perfect excuse for older people to dance like wobblies. And, much to the chagrin of my children, when my wife and I, dance around the room in our 1980s, 90s dance moves. And they just look at us with disdain. But I think this is the perfect excuse, because it's movement. It's not just a restricted sort of movement on one plane. It's movement. So
that's it. Yeah, absolutely, 100% right. And after all that dancing, you're going to be tired. So I think the most impactful thing on telomere length is sleep, or sleep deprivation. It just does a number on our telomerase. So I think it's just, I can't emphasize enough how important sleep is. And the more I've become very self-aware of sleep, because it's an area of my own health that I'm still learning how to make better. That being said, my sensitivity has really also made me aware of, ask all my patients about it. I spend a little more time talking with them about it. And boy, sleep is a big issue for most people. Most of us are not getting nearly enough. And when we do get into bed, we don't sleep well.
That's right.
So we are just, I think, increasingly a sleep-deprived culture has huge, huge implications on our health, our cancer risk, and telomeres really suffer.
Yeah. And this is why, you and I have spoken about L-theanine before. I'm a big fan of magnesium, and it's almost like it's not a panacea. It's not it will work in everybody, but I just think there's so many people that have issues with sleep, with restful sleep, rejuvenating sleep. And I think we need to change that vernacular. It's not sleep. Everybody sleeps. It's just for how long and how much rest they get during that. But I think this restful, peaceful sleep is something that we really need to work on.
Yeah, and yes, I agree. And I like magnesium for another reason too, which is that as we start to understand how it is that these lifestyle behaviors ultimately translate into shortening our telomeres, the sort of mitigating process is oxidative stress. So that the more oxidative stress that occurs in our cells, the more likely our telomerase enzyme is downregulated, and then our telomeres shorten. And this has a lot to do with mitochondrial health and functionality. And I think that when we think about sleep, one of the biggest problems when we don't get enough sleep is that we don't give ourselves the time under the influence of melatonin to restore our endogenous antioxidants, to do the repair we need to mitigate all that oxidative stress that's accumulated over the day. So we're always kind of trying to catch up. And so magnesium, to your point, and actually theanine to some extent as well, is so important to mitochondrial health and to giving our cells the nutrient, one of the nutrients it needs to help restore that glutathione system. So I think you get kind of a 2-for-1 with magnesium in this respect.
Yeah. Well, so let's look at the poster child of any sort of cancer support, and that'd be curcumin from turmeric. Is there any facility of turmeric with telomeres?
Yeah, that's a good question. To my knowledge, that has not been directly studied, but I could surmise that there's a connection because, hopefully most of the listeners know, curcumin is really good at downregulating NF-kappa B, the major inflammatory regulator in the cell, and conversely upregulating NRF2, which is involved in increasing our endogenous antioxidant production. So NRF2 upregulation just literally turns on genes that make glutathione peroxidase and things like that. So one would surmise then that under the influence of curcumin, we'd have better ability to control oxidative stress, and in doing that, to preserve our telomerase. So that's all theoretical. To my knowledge, that hasn't been directly studied, but I would sure lay money on the fact that that's happening.
Yeah. And I have to ask, what about these supplements that are sort of popping up? I've got to say, normally in the US market, it would be illegal in Australia to make a claim like this, but you're getting these, telomere type supplements. They're sort of targeted for telomeres. Do you think that's really applicable yet? Do you think we can say that? Or do you think that's really more of a claim, a bit of a wild claim, and we really need to be looking at, diet and lifestyle things and some basic type of support mechanisms, which, I'm going to say the word antioxidant. I'm not a big fan of this, hero electron trapper, but that anti-inflammatory type nutrition.
Well, it's interesting. It's a good question because there is a huge movement in the States. In fact, there's even a big association of doctors that are about what's so-called as anti-aging. So the idea being that if we can find ways to reduce primarily the oxidative stress and preserve, vital organelle function within the cells, then maybe we can actually extend our life. And that's based on some good science. Just sleep. If you sleep good 8 hours a night most of your life, you're going to live on average, I think it's about 3.5 years longer than your neighbor who's not sleeping well. So there's definitely, data points along the way. From a supplement perspective, there's a lot of, I would categorize it as theoretical or very early clinical studies. If there are clinical studies on nutrients like resveratrol is a popular one in this regard, or fish oil, essential fatty acids, or green tea that you mentioned. And these things have been, often studied in vitro and in animals and shown to have impact on telomerase. And some, as I said, a very few handful of clinical studies indicate that there's benefit in humans, but there's not been any long-term studies, and we're talking about long-term life extension. So we really can't say for sure that this does that. So I think for me, it's like, okay, so we have all these different opportunities to take supplements. I think we have to consider what other benefits would this particular combination or ingredient provide for me, and are there any risks to taking this, and do kind of a benefit-risk analysis, and if it comes out in favor of benefit, at this point, I think it's probably likely to be a benefit.
Yeah. But I guess my point was, I think they're a benefit for other reasons, and we can't yet say that it's because of telomeres. I think the claim of telomeres is a little bit premature, but the other benefits, yeah, sure.
Agreed.
Yeah. But I think sleep, restful, peaceful sleep, with let's say a well-practiced sleep hygiene. It sounds such a weird term, sleep hygiene, but anyway. But, some good sleep practices along with good exercise that involves natural movement and expression of movement, including dancing. And then obviously the social interaction with a healthful, well-balanced Mediterranean-style diet. I think those three would be the top ones that we'd have. We can institute those without any supplements being imbibed at all, can't we?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's clearly, I would agree with you. That's the foundation. And then I think adding into that kind of a de-stressing something or other. This fascinating stuff, but also there's a study that I remember reading about people who were depressed, who, I think it was a study of women, but women who were depressed, but who also had high resilience. So they had kind of greater ability to bounce back from difficult events and to sort of feel depressed, but then to reemerge and see the positive. Those women didn't have shortened telomeres, whereas the women who were depressed that didn't have as much resilience did have shorter telomeres. So
that's interesting.
Just another example. Yeah, I think that there's the basics are so critical. If you just look at cell health from the perspective, from the lens of telomeres, it really does come down to good food, good rest, good movement, and good mood.
Yeah. Good food, good movement, good mood. I'm sure we can make an acronym somewhere out of that. I'll need to sleep on it.
Yeah. There you go. But I do think, and I don't want to just also, completely pass over the potential role of supplementation, because I do believe that the world that we live in is tremendously oxidatively stressful. And, I think it's just hard given all the demands that we've put on ourselves to expect that people can, really eat well all the time, sleep well most of their life, get exercise most days. That's what we want. And that's absolutely what we should strive to help every person that we encounter to do. And at the same time, I think that there's so much oxidative stress coming our way from the environment, from, weird things that are found in our foods, even healthy foods, from household products, from just the stress of being doers rather than beers. And I think that over time, that kind of wears down our ability to compensate. So I do feel like there is a role for targeted nutritional supplementation for some of these people, just to kind of give them that extra edge and try to facilitate what all those lifestyle changes are encouraging and building.
Totally agree. What I find interesting, though, is like when we're looking at curcumin, yes, absolutely. It is my favorite supplement, I've got to say. But you can also do a lot with dietary intake just by adding it to things like stir fries, and you can add and add and add and add and stir and add and add. You can put in a really hefty dose of turmeric into a stir fry meal. Keeping it nice and safe with some good oils and things like that. Some garlic. So. I think this co-management, if you like, supplements don't have to be all a plate of tablets. They can be a plate of food, good healthy food, almost targeted food with some judiciously added supplements along the side.
Yeah, and I think that maybe this is another opportunity where we can think about using these, in this case, curcumin or turmeric in different doses at different times. Because, if we're incorporating it into our diet, we would think, okay, we're going to get a lot of different, a variety of actions from curcumin, the net effect of which tends to be an anti-inflammatory, sort of antioxidative one.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when we look at, there's all no clinical trials on this, but when we look at in vitro cellular studies, we know that when we apply high doses of curcumin to tumor cells, it actually decreases telomerase and shortens telomeres in cancer cells. So might that be a dose effect? Or maybe, like we see in a lot of other instances, compounds have a differential effect on a healthy cell compared to a malignant cell, just because of the different characteristics in those cells.
Yeah.
But I think it does sort of, makes me scratch my head and think, I wonder if perhaps just from a big generalization perspective, maybe it makes sense to think about turmeric in the diet for prevention. And then when we're really dealing with a malignancy, maybe we have to sort of step it up a bit.
Salient words. So to wrap it all up, the telomerase issue, where should we focus? I think we've discussed the sleep, the exercise, the food. What do you tell patients with regards to, do you test for telomerase or telomeres? Do you actually actively test for those in your patients?
It's a really good question. And I've struggled a bit with this because there are tests available. So what we know is that there are, the telomere length in your white blood cells are going to be different than the telomere length in your colon cells or in your, cheek cells. So where do we test? Most telomere testing is done on white blood cells, and that's because those are easily accessible, and they're important because they signify immunity. And so it's really become kind of the standard when we're looking at human clinical studies and just how to go forward. But we still don't know really how well that correlates with telomere length in especially tissues that are in organs that are under high proliferation stress.
Yeah, that's what I was
which happens to be the site of all major cancers, right? Because it's digestive tract, colon cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. And that's where we really want to make sure our telomeres are nice and long and healthy. And is that test really telling us that? We don't know for sure. So there's a little bit of a question mark in my mind about, therefore, the utility of doing that test. I think, though, if our main question is, okay, is this person healthy from an immunological perspective, and do they have kind of a robust immune system? One part of that answer might be to assess their telomere length. And I think in that case, those tests, as I said, are very easy to do and very readily available to practitioners now. And you can see changes. When you then, the only real reason to do that would be if it's going to motivate the patient or motivate you to focus on certain strategies that you would then want to remeasure the impact of. So I think you could do it again and see if what you're doing actually made a difference. But having said all that, I actually don't test very often for the reasons I just said. And I tend to think, I'm going to recommend a good diet and more sleep and more movement anyway.
Yeah, treatment remains the same.
Unless the patient's really needing unless they're really needing some objective, motivating kind of, piece of paper that will show benefit, I probably would just bypass the test and just go for the strategy.
Yeah. I wonder if maybe, obviously if there's going to be a willing oncologist who's doing a biopsy, whether it be a fine needle or a core biopsy or an excision of a tumour, that, if it were able to test the actual tumour at, say, several sites and look at the telomeres, what they were doing there, then maybe that might give a better picture of potential risk.
Yeah, and I think I think there's a lot that's going to happen in the future with regards to what we do with those samples of tumors that we get out, because this is just one of many things that particularly if we learn that we can reliably downregulate telomerase in malignant cells by targeting TERT or something else, and that becomes, and we have a strategy to do that, and it's going to lead very much to let's see what's going on with telomerase in a cancer cell so we know if it's a target. And I think this is part of the whole, oncology is evolving to this molecular profiling of tumors and genomic and molecular profiling of tumors, which will become the way we understand tumors.
Yeah.
To the point, I was on a panel recently, and one of the physicians said something really interesting, which I'll repeat, which he said, in the future, it's very likely that we will no longer talk about breast cancer and prostate cancer and colon cancer. We're just going to talk about, it won't matter where the tumors came from or where they grew. What's going to matter is what is unique about the genomic and the molecular profile of this tumor and what array of therapies will best target this tumor. And I think that's the future of oncology. So this, I think, is one piece of that sort of mosaic that we'll eventually see, hopefully in our lifetimes.
You know what? I actually hope that happens, because that will take out a lot of the dogma. I'm going to say the word sexism, but that's not right. But the sex discrimination between different types of cancers, breast versus prostate, for instance, colon cancer, it's something that's up your bottom, so we don't want to talk about it. There's these weird dogmas that exist because of, it might not be in a nice area, or it might have something to do with your gender. So I actually look forward to that day.
Yeah, I do too, because I also think that it sort of levels the playing field about, it gets us out of these ruts of, okay, for first stage breast cancer, the regimen is to use, Cytoxan and Taxotere times 4, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, what does this person's tumor, where are the vulnerabilities in this particular person's tumor?
Yeah. Absolutely. Lise, I love your wealth of knowledge. It's so broad, but also so deep. We can just dive into any area with regards to, especially cancer, because that's obviously your passion with helping people, but even the nuances that go alongside that, the anxiety and the sleep and things like that. I love discussing these things because you give practical things that practitioners can use in their patients tomorrow, and you also keep in mind that it's the patient that we are caring for. And I got to say, I bow to you. I love you. You're an amazing lady. So thank you so much for joining us once again on FX Medicine.
Well, my pleasure. You bring out the best in us, Andrew. Thank you.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today on FX Medicine, please engage with us and let us know what further topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in contact with us through our website, fxmedicine.com.au, or look for FX Medicine in your favourite social media platform. You can also rate and review us on iTunes, and we'd really like to thank those who have already rated us. It's through your continued support that enables us to bring you current, complex and relevant topics to enhance your practice of natural medicine.